Well, we're back with the literary edition of We Don't Color on the Dog. Somewhat. We have my guest is an expert in pulp magazines, which is if you read any Walker Holmes, I lean into that pretty hard. We've got David Earle, who's the Dean of Arts and Social Sciences and Humanities at UWF. David, thank you for doing this.
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to take the dean hat off and to put my English professor hat back on. It's been a while since I was in the classroom, so more than happy to talk about all the above.
Well, it was funny because what happened was I started doing a couple audiobooks on Dashiell Hammett
Yeah.
and got really hooked on the Continental Op, which is, of course, we know, he's known for the Maltese Falcon but it was, it really reminded me of our conversation at Hubs. So, what drew you to pulp magazines?
So, pulp magazines at first, maybe just if there are any audience members who aren't familiar with what they are, the pulp magazines were really working class magazines. I mean, it was the reading material, the literary material for the working class. Started in the late 1890s, really up into the 1950s, and they started as sort of general fiction magazines. But the competition in the marketplace, I mean, they were very popular. So the competition in the marketplace was so great. And because they didn't carry advertising, they relied on newsstand sales. Publishers would look and see what issues sold the best. So over the course of the teens, editors noticed that mystery stories started outselling other general fiction magazines. If there was a mystery story on the cover, that magazine sold more. So they had the bright idea to splinter off magazines into different genres. So pulp magazines, which are produced on wood pulp paper, cheap paper, were really produced for in high volume, quickly produced for disposal. You read it, you throw it away for commuters on the train. I mean, they're sort of an urban product. But so over the course of the teens, genres started rising up to the top. So by the 90s, a lot of these general fiction magazines splintered into specific genres. And this is where modern science fiction comes from. This is where hard-boiled fiction comes from. Really, the American detective fiction comes out of these magazines. There were westerns and romance that sort of predated the pulps, but all these genres really solidified really over the course of the teens and the 20s. For me, really, I got started at a young age. A lot of people are introduced to this type of fiction when I mean, I think I was about 12 or 13 years old, and my dad, who, was born in 1924 and was a huge Doc Savage fan back in the Depression in his early years. He would tell me about the pulps, and we had one anthology, a book that came out mid 70s, maybe by Tony Goodstone, called The Pulps, and it had all these great salacious covers of these magazines. They always had great covers because they had to compete with other magazines on the newsstand. And that's where I was introduced to pulp fiction at an early age. And that would be authors like Edgar Rice Burroughs, right? Tarzan came out in 1912 in All Story magazine. Zorro, Flash Gordon, all of these kind of really prototypical American fictional heroes came out in the pulp magazines. So I kind of cut my teeth on reading those and slowly evolved from that kind of adventure fiction and sort of early proto science fiction to Dashiell Hammett and
Mhm.
Raymond Chandler. And for me, the jump from them, that kind of terse fiction, was logical. Then I jumped into Ernest Hemingway, and from him to William Faulkner, and then I became an English professor. So, more or less, that's my trajectory. But pulp magazines always fascinated me. So when I was in grad school, I decided to talk about modernist literature and modernist literary forms, but do it through the lens of pulp magazine and look for sort of relationships between the two. And Hammett, who you started talking about, is the perfect example of someone who is both popular and very literary and was able to walk that divide, which is sort of a later construction, but the divide between kind of capital literature and popular literature.
Well, and then it's funny because it was my teens too. It was the Shadow, the Spider, which is a kind of a different version of all that. Doc Savage hit my table too, and then of course the movies picked it up. Humphrey Bogart would not be anywhere without the pulp magazine characters. Yeah.
Yeah, Yeah, going all the way back to silent films. I mean, the Hollywood and the film industry, I should say, in general, they look to these pulp magazines for story ideas. And an awful lot of the authors graduated from the pulp magazines and went to Hollywood and had very successful careers, screenwriters, but a ton of films, and a lot of them sort of B pictures, but really some very successful films in the 30s and the 40s especially were taken from pulp novels. I mean hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of now forgotten westerns, for example, are. But yeah, I mean Maltese Falcon is of course a prime example of it. The Glass
Big Sleep.
Key, which
Big Sleep was another one. Lady
yeah,
in
yeah, yeah, Chandler. I mean, so many of this stuff, and not even that sort of straight adaptation, but the tropes of the genre, right? The gumshoe with his feet up on the desk and a pint of whiskey in his drawer, and the dame who walks into his office with a problem. I mean, that was all invented in the pulp magazines. You know, the hard-boiled fiction, what we think about in terms of American detective fiction versus British locked door mystery, right?
right,
That
right. Yeah. Yeah. What are some of the tropes of good pulp fiction, let's say detective type story? What do you see?
So detective, right? So it would be usually urban stories, right? A lot of them have to do with the tensions of these burgeoning cities of the teens, and even really earlier. I mean, it comes out, it sort of starts in the 1890s, with kind of earlier pseudo-British fiction, maybe the early Nick Carter stories. But by the teens of the 1920s, when it becomes very much an American form, you've got a very individualistic hero or private eye who blurs the line between good and bad. Usually, he's a good guy with a very strong code of ethics, but he can dip into the sort of seamy side of life. He's very familiar with the dark side, and sometimes blur those lines between whether he's good or bad. So you've got urban fiction, you've got this kind of ambiguous hero. The femme fatale kind of rises out of that as well, even though mostly conceived of as a film trope rather than a literary trope.
Hmm.
But I mean, that's Maltese Falcon for sure. Bridget O'Shaughnessy's definitely a femme fatale. Um, and of course, sort of hyperviolence to a certain extent. I mean, it's the one guy alone against unconquerable odds and sort of at the whims of fate, but usually beats his way up to the top,
Right, right. Well,
or
yeah,
t
and
or
they're
takes a
imperfect.
beating.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's kind of Walker Holmes, but but it is, it's they're imperfect heroes.
Y-
They're not
Yeah,
superheroes. They do get bloodied. They
right.
do get beat up. They
Yep.
do, which sort of makes it even, I think, even makes it better than a comic where everybody's rarely gets hurt. He can get hurt, and the people around him can get hurt.
Sure. Yep. Not yeah, and usually do. I mean, when I say urban, a lot of this is, and it didn't start. So, I mean, the first detective story magazine, the first detective magazine's 1915. It starts, and by that time, that the genre had not solidified yet. But it doesn't take long, I mean, Hammett is 1920, 22, 21, 22. He starts publishing in Black Mask, the magazine, and between him and another author named Carol John Daly, who's considered the first hard-boiled detective author with his Race Williams story. At that point, the all those generic conventions are starting to solidify. Another thing is usually terser fiction, what we would think of as sort of hard-boiled or snappy dialogue, that kind of things. A lot of that comes because this was popular fiction, so it had to read very quickly, right? So even though authors got paid by the word, so sometimes, they wanted to load their fiction with a lot of superfluous language. For the most part, and this is where Hammett really excelled, it was that terse fiction and snappy dialogue, that give or take between the characters, it really became almost definitely part of the art form. It really became elevated to something that's purely American.
Yeah, the other thing that stands out too, David, with Hammett is, and some of it is, they don't they use the jargon. You've got to figure it out. They're not going to explain it to you. It probably put off some, but you dive into the character and the scene so much quicker in
Yeah.
these stories.
Well, and a funny story, if I can So one of my favorite stories about kind of just language in general and how language works is in the Maltese Falcon. At one point, Sam Spade is talking about Wilmer the gun tough, and he says to Caspar Gutman, he says, "And get that gunsel away from me, or I'll kill him. You hear me? I'll kill him." So because of that line, because that book was so popular for decades, even now, gunsel, Gunsel, means gun tough. But the way Sam Spade used it, it was actually Yiddish slang for a homosexual,
Oh, okay.
right? So whereas he's insulting there, it passes the censors. Even in the film, even the Bogey film, that made it into. I mean, Ford is just. I mean, he's the most literary of directors, so that made it into the film. But almost instantly in other pulp fiction, because if someone's makes it big, other authors jump in and try and break the formula. You start seeing gunsel appearing to mean gun tough because no one understood the Yiddish slang for it. So it's one of those moments where you can actually trace the history of a word. So if you look up that word now in the Oxford English Dictionary, it's got two meanings. It's got the Yiddish meaning, and it also has Hammett's meaning too, or it actually means like gun tough, right?
Right,
It's a
right.
people have misappropriated it.
That's great.
So
Yeah, the other thing, and I don't want to eat up too much of your time, but the other thing, talk about, and you mentioned it earlier, is how pulp fiction worked its way into literary fiction. Hemingway, is one of my favorites, and you're a scholar in Hemingway. Talk just a little bit about that, David.
sure. So even like you and I were talking, Hemingway has a kid, uh, and really early on, I mean, this fiction, I said, 1818 is the form of that magazine, the pulp magazine starts. And there were magazines like Blue Book and Argosy. Argosy was the first one that would have romance fiction, it would have detective fiction, it would have adventure fiction, it would have outdoor fiction, whatever, all mixed in. And this is what Hemingway read as a kid. There weren't bookstores for the most part, really, I mean, until the mid 20th century, everybody got their reading at drugstores, and Hemingway is no exception. So we have in the archives, there are actually letters of Hemingway's to pulp editors when he sent them early stories. His first couple stories that he did as a high school kid for his yearbook, I think, and one's a trapper story, one's a boxing story, and they're pure pulp fiction. And he was writing this even when he was convalescing or after the First World War. There are stories of him that he's writing in Italy that we've got fragments of that are all the formulaic conventions of pulp fiction. So Hemingway talks about his lost briefcase of early stories. Later on, he said it was the best thing that ever happened to him. I'm convinced that that was full of bad pulp stories. And luckily, he never got published in the pulps. And he came under the influence of Sherwood Anderson and Gertrude Stein and Ezra Pound, and quickly became a modernist author. But even in a lot of his novels, he's trying to walk this fine line between a literary text and one that has popular appeal, which he ended up doing really well.
Well, and his dialogue's really punchy. That's how, when you said that, it made sense to me because you really, one thing I always liked about Hemingway is his dialogue is just so crisp and not, it doesn't have a lot of extra words, and it
Yeah.
conveys a huge message.
Well, and that of course is the journalism as well. I mean, that really, right? That's where, whereas I think the love for fiction and writing started with the pulps, the love of craft came from his experience as a journalist. So, yeah,
Well, David, thank you for our viewers and listeners. We're going to be doing
sure,
a panel
that's
next
right.
month. Let's go ahead and push that. That's what, the 18th? We got it the
It's
18th.
it's the 17th, right? So it's a Wednesday night at the Museum of Commerce. And thank you so much for contributing to this. But it's going to be three Pensacola crime writers. It's yourself, it's Mike Papantonio, and it's Corbett Davis. And I've been working my way through everyone's fiction, and it's great. I think we're lucky to have three mystery writers here in Pensacola, and we're going to talk about why is that, of course. So I invite everybody, and maybe we can even talk about some pulps. I did grab a couple show and tell items there. There's a detective story magazine from 1916, the first year of detective fiction magazines, and then of course Hammett So I have to talk a little bit about Black Mask, which is the magazine where Hammett starts. But we can talk more about this. I invite everyone to come and support you and your fiction and everyone else's and Pensacola culture in general at the talk.
We'll do it, and we'll do more of these, and definitely beer soon.
Absolutely. Even though it should be what, rye whiskey, I think, in a dirty glass. I think that's what it's supposed
Exactly.
to be.
Yeah. All right, David. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thanks. You too.
Ah, about that.